much of the work that he's been doing lately, especially around this idea of outcomes over outputs. So we're definitely going to give Josh the opportunity to share some of his thoughts around that. And then we'll bounce questions back and forth based on what it is that you want to ask Josh, and a little bit of what I want to ask him as well. To give you a sense of who we are, so my name is Jeff Gothelf. Josh and I have written a couple of books together, Lean UX and Sense and Respond. We have also been business partners in the past and continue to be colleagues and business partners today, most recently with Sense and Respond Press. Sense and Respond Press is a business book publishing press, and we publish short, practical books for busy executives on topics like digital transformation, business agility, design, product management, all of the things that busy executives need to know today. And one of the things that we've been doing a lot of lately is taking these same authors that have written books for us. And so far we've got 8 books published, at least 4 more on the way, if I recall correctly. We've been taking those same folks and we're putting together a series of speaking events inside companies, bringing them into companies and helping them build sort of a regular cadence of content in those companies. And so it's been a lot of fun getting to know and to work with Josh over the years. I'm going to let him talk here in just a second, but I did want to, if you don't know who Josh is, how could you not know who Josh is, really? But but I will, I'll tell you about a tiny bit about Josh. I'll let him wrap it up, and then he's going to take it away. Josh is a designer and a coach, and he's been designing things since the internet mouse was invented. Someday, maybe you'll be lucky enough for him to tell you that story about the internet mouse. He works with teams to help them design and launch new businesses and new products, and he helps teams and organizations be more agile with a lowercase a rather than the capital A, the religion of it. The way this webinar is going to play out is I'm going to hand over to Josh basically right about now. He's going to go through a presentation for the next 10 to 15 minutes, nothing terribly long. And then we'll drop out of presentation mode and we can discuss questions. If you have questions that you would like Josh to answer, there is a Q&A module at the bottom of the webinar interface. If you click that Q&A webinar module, that's where I will be looking for questions to ask Josh. If you put them in the chat, I may see them, but I can't guarantee they'll make it into the queue. And so if you've got a question to ask, please put it in the Q&A module. That allows me to keep track of those questions as we go along. So 15 minutes of presentation and then Q&A discussion. We should wrap up just about a minute or two before the top of the hour. And this is being recorded, by the way. So if you have to drop off early or if you have colleagues who could not make it at the moment, this will go up on the Sense and Respond Press YouTube channel within a couple of weeks. That's my optimistic point of view about that. And so with that, I will hand over to Josh. We're going to talk about outcomes today. Josh, my friend, take it away.
All right. Thank you so much, Jeff. And thanks all of you folks who have joined us for this webinar today. It's great to see so many of you virtually. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the material that's in my new book, Outcomes Over Outputs, and introduce some of the kind of key concepts here. And then we'll get into Q&A and we'll talk about what you want to know. If you're interested in the book, you can find it at bit.ly/outcomesbook. I wrote this book for, I guess, 2 big reasons. The first was, one of the things I noticed is that this phrase that you hear, outcomes over output, it's almost like a slogan in the agile world, and but the problem with slogans is it doesn't always carry the subtlety or the meaning that you need to make the idea work, right? So everybody nods their head, they say, yeah, we should be more outcome focused. And then when teams are trying to be outcome focused, they discover that it's really hard. And so in working in my consulting practice with teams and businesses who are trying to be more outcome focused, I discovered, a set of techniques that, either my colleagues were using or that I was figuring out or that teams were using that really seemed to work, that help us get past the slogan. And that's what I hope to capture in this book. So it's a short, practical book. It talks about how to put this notion of outcomes over output into action. And it starts by saying, let's get really, really precise about the definition of outcomes that we're using. And the best definition that I've come across is this: an outcome is a measurable change in human behavior that drives business results. It's a change in behavior that drives business results. Now, we can talk about this behavior, about this definition later during the Q&A, but the point to remember here is that it's a really strict definition, and by using a strict definition, it helps us in our work. Let me illustrate what this means, though. And to do that, I want to tell you a little story. I want you to imagine that you work in a sort of mid-sized town somewhere in the American Northeast, perhaps in Massachusetts. And you are responsible, you work in the city government, and your boss comes to you and says, Josh, I'd like you to get control of this dangerous intersection in our town. And you go down to this intersection and you see it's a T intersection, but nobody's stopping. You're supposed to stop at a T intersection, but nobody is stopping. And you also see people are turning left, and there's very clearly this arrow that says right turn only, and yet people are turning left. And so you go back to your boss and you say, boss, I've got a plan with the Department of Public Works. We're going to put up some traffic signs. They'll say stop. They'll say no left turn, and we'll get control of the intersection. And the boss looks at your plan. He looks at the budget, looks at how much time it's going to take, and says, go. And so you do it. With the Department of Public Works, you put up these signs: stop sign, no left turn. They're perfect, right? And you're very proud of your work. And the next day you go down to the intersection to watch what's happening. And you see, hey, look, nobody is stopping. And everyone keeps turning left. So what's the takeaway from this story? Well, I want to start breaking this down into the language that we'll use for the rest of the hour. Your boss comes to you and says, look, I want you to create an impact. An impact is the high level change in value that the business, in this case, the organization, the municipality is seeking, right? The municipality wants a safer intersection. They want safer streets. In business, it's often the impact here are things like profit, cost, customer retention, customer loyalty, the highest level sort of measures of success. So your boss comes to you and says, you want this safer street. And you go and you study the situation and you come back with a plan. You say, we're going to create this output. We're going to make street signs. And here are the resources that we'll need. We need people from the Department of Public Works. And here's what we're going to do. We're going to make the signs and we're going to install them. And so when you're successful, you've created this output, the street signs. But what's missing here is that you didn't generate the outcome that you were seeking. You wanted people to stop turning left. And even with the street signs, they continue to make these left turns. So you didn't change driver behavior, right? And it's that change in driver behavior that would have created the business impact, the municipal impact that we wanted. Now, just to kind of come back to this picture for a second, the output here is the street signs. And the outcome we're seeking is to change driver behavior. Now, it didn't work, but there's something interesting here, which is that there was nothing wrong with the outputs, right? We made perfect street signs. They matched the national standards. They were installed on time. They were installed on budget, okay? They just didn't have they didn't create the outcome that we were seeking. Okay, so very often in our work, in our companies, we focus on making perfect output. We build a new feature. We add a button. We create a web page. We launch an app. Right? And those things can be perfect. They can match the specification. They can be defect-free. And yet they can create no value for our business, because the value that we seek is the outcome, right? We're trying to change behavior in a way that generates business results. Let me pull that into a quick case study for you, and then we'll move on to Q&A. This is a story from a client of mine that I worked with, I guess it was over a year ago by now, a client called Taproot Foundation. Taproot Foundation are a nonprofit here in New York City, based here in New York City. And their mission, what they do is they work with other nonprofit organizations, nonprofits that have limited budgets, but that need professional services. So financial planning, marketing plans, human resource planning, that kind of thing. They work with nonprofits, and they work with skilled volunteers who want to make a difference. So these are people who might be HR people or marketing people or financial planners in their full-time work who want to offer their professional services to nonprofits. And so Taproot Foundation matches volunteers with nonprofits. And then they act as a kind of glue, and they operate a 3-month to 6-month consulting engagement between the volunteers and the nonprofits. So that's the background for this case study. I was working with this Taproot Foundation team, and they'd been given a mission. Their mission was, for the coming financial year, your team needs to increase the Net Promoter Score of the service that you offer. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with Net Promoter Score, Net Promoter Score is just simply a technique to try and understand whether your customers will recommend your service to their friends and colleagues. For those of you who are familiar with Net Promoter Score, I'm not going to get into the controversy about whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm just telling you, my client was trying to increase their Net Promoter Score. And so when they came to me, they said, look, we know what the business impact is that we're trying to create. We've been given this mandate to increase the Net Promoter Score of our service. And our problem is we have no idea of what to do in order to increase the Net Promoter Score. What should we plan? We need to deliver a plan for the coming year, and we don't know what to do to increase Net Promoter Score. And so a lot of times teams that are given these sort of very high level impacts face this kind of problem, right? They've been given something that's important for the business to work on, but it's so big and it's so vague, and there's so many factors that go into it that it's very difficult for a team to figure out whether they can independently influence that, right? Can one team change Net Promoter Score? And if they can, where should they start? And so we started with the question, what are the outcomes that we're trying to achieve that will increase Net Promoter Score? And we asked it very specifically, what are the measurable changes in behavior that will create this result? And this is why that precise definition is really important, because instead of saying, what are the outcomes that will increase Net Promoter Score, we can say, what are the changes in user behavior? What are the changes in customer behavior? And what are the changes in employee behavior that will create this result? And when we start asking about behavior, how we change behavior, we have to start understanding the behavior in the system. And so we created a map, simple map, swim lanes on the top for the volunteers, the sellers of the service that they're offering, right? On the bottom for the nonprofits, and in the middle for the people at Taproot Foundation. And we said, when we deliver this consulting service, what are all the behaviors in the system? What are all the things people do during one of these projects? For example, in the beginning of the project, they need to meet each other and scope the project and decide how they're going to work together. And then in phase 2, they kick off the project. And in phase 3, they do the work together. In phase 4, they close it out, right? So what are all the things that people are doing? Then we went back through the map, and we had a pretty good list of what everybody was doing. We went back through the map and we said, okay, what are the things that people are doing that are important success factors? So for example, when people met each other in person early in the project, that was an important success factor. And similarly, what were the things that people did that caused them to fail? So when people didn't respond to email, project tended to go badly. So we labeled all of these success factors and failure factors. And then what we did was we prioritized them. We said, which ones are the most important? Which ones are the ones that we want to work on? Which ones do we think will have the biggest bang for the buck as if we spend energy on these things? And then we prioritized them, and we simply made a prioritized list. And we said, look, we think it's really important for people to respond quickly to email when they're doing a project, right? So we're going to focus very aggressively on getting people to respond to email quickly. And it's really important when we have meetings, we schedule meetings, for people to show up at the meetings. So we're really going to focus on meeting attendance, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we made this list of the outcomes that we were seeking that became our plan for the year. It became our roadmap, right? Now, to bring this back to this, what we call the logic model, right? The team had been given this goal to create this impact, increase net promoter score. And we had just done this work and come up with a list of outcomes that we wanted to focus on for the coming year. That is our prioritized list of outcomes that we were seeking. Now, the team then had started by saying, we're not sure what we're going to do. Well, guess what? We've got our prioritized list, and we still don't know what we're going to work on. We just know what our targets are. Now, for a lot of people, this is a problem, but at this point, I'm going to tell you this is actually a good thing. You've made a plan of what you want to work on for the year. You would be crazy at this point to say, we are 100% certain that if we build stop signs, we're going to get people to stop at the intersection. We haven't done that work yet. We don't know what will create our outcomes. And so at this point, what we can do is we can start to capture our planned work as hypotheses. We can say, we believe that we'll get people to respond to email more often if we do these things. And then we can take that, and actually when we start to work on it, our work starts to look like a continuous conversation. It starts to look like sensing and responding, where we ship something, we do a little experiment, we sense if it works, and then we respond to what we learn. And this is why I say that outcomes, working this way, declaring your outcomes in advance, are a way to increase your team's agility, right? Because instead of locking in on the specific outputs that you plan to make, instead you focus on what the result will be. And you continue to ship, sense, and respond in an agile manner, right, until you achieve enough of that result that you're ready to move on. Okay, so last thing I'm going to leave you with, again, is this definition of outcomes. An outcome, remember, is a measurable change in behavior that drives business results. And from here, I think we can move into the Q&A.
Excellent. Nicely done, Josh. And you got the people talking, which is good.
Right on.
Excellent. Somebody asked for the URL for the book. There it is again, bit.ly outcomes book. Remember that with bit.ly links, it's case sensitive. So capital O, capital B, and that's how you know it's actually going to work. By the way, it's very, very important, you know, when you work with someone for a long time, that you wear matching headsets so that you know exactly, exactly how you'll hear the other in every one of these situations. All right, let's get to content. Enough joking around. Lots of questions in the question module for you, Josh. And so and remember, if you've got other questions, put them in the Q&A module, because it's hard for me to manage the chat and the Q&A module and keep the conversation flowing. So one place for the questions would be great. We'll share the brand of the headset later in the show notes. Somebody asked about the brand. Okay. First question from Dan. Hey, Dan. He says, what mechanisms or processes have you found useful in interrogating whether the impact goal is really the desired impact? Think about things like dark patterns can produce impact. So is that what we really desire? Or maybe asked a different way, what tactics open up the room to ask this question in a business environment?
Yeah. So what typically when we're talking about the impact level, those things tend to be handed down from on high, right? They tend to be kind of the product of strategic planning, right? So our impact this year, as we think about our organizational strategy, might be, we want to increase our market share in Europe, right? Or we want to shore up our support in this market demographic. So those tend to be the output of strategic planning, and in that sense, they are they're kind of a given, right? Mm-hmm. And I think there's a lot of work in the strategy universe for like how you get to those strategic outcomes. But I think the sort of the focus on outcomes is about, okay, given that these are our strategic objectives, how do we get there? And I think the other part of your question that I heard, which is about how do you avoid dark patterns, that's a really, really interesting and important one. And I think what is really useful when you're working with outcomes is to use outcome pairs or kind of bounding outcomes, right? So let's say the outcome you're trying to achieve is you're trying to get more people to sign up for your mailing list, right? Well, one way to do that would be to launch a phishing campaign, right? And just go out and trick people into signing up for your mailing list, right? Great, you'd make your mailing list huge, right? So how do you set an outcome that prevents the use of that dark pattern, right? And it might be something like, well, we want to increase the number of signups, and we want to increase the number of signups from some category of some way of defining a real customer, right? So a desirable customer, not a bot or somebody we've tricked into signing up. We want people who sign up for our list to stay on our list and not unsubscribe within the first 3 weeks, right? Things like that. So really important to use kind of bounding metrics to maintain the quality of the work, right? So that you're not just gaming the system and producing these sort of second order effects that are undesirable.
And I think it's worth asking the question too, right? We work with a lot of HR teams, and the initiatives and the policies that HR teams make are products. They are decisions that affect the lives or the behaviors of staff in this particular case, right? So you take a product like unlimited vacation, right? What's the outcome that a company or an HR department is trying to gain by shipping the policy, the unlimited vacation policy? Well, they probably want more inbound applications, maybe higher quality applications. Maybe they're trying to poach some people from other companies. Well, what is the actual outcome that you get from that? In the United States, what you end up with is people taking actually less vacation. Right. And so
how do you encourage people, right? Are you is your outcome a recruiting outcome, or is your outcome like actually my workforce is refreshed and happy and, using vacation appropriately?
Right. Not burning out and quitting. Right. So retention, right. Which is interesting. Right? And so the bounded outcome pairs, I think, is a really good thing here. It's like, we want to see the quality of applications coming in go up. That's an outcome, but we don't want to do that at the expense of people burning out, ultimately taking fewer days off and quitting. So, excellent. And I think you answered this next question. So Mark wanted to know basically why sets of outcomes over a single outcome, but I feel like we've answered that. I feel like that's the.
Well, there's one thing to say about sets of outcomes, which is that all of this takes place in the context of of complex systems, right? So it's not like, if I make a red button, sales go up. Right? like we know that, but we're not building these kind of simplistic and kind of deterministic machines, right? Where there are a lot of things going on. And so the thing that leads us to higher revenue is not just the work of one team or a single button or a one good bit of copy, right? It's the effort of lots of teams working on lots of things. And so understanding that sort of outcomes live in a system that all hopefully drive to this impact is really important. And so in the thing that I showed on the screen a couple of times is this what's called a logic model. The logic model illustrates a single kind of logical path, but there are really many factors in these paths that lead to impacts, and the sort of there's a complementary model that you can use with logic models called the theory of change, which kind of describes all of the big factors and how the system of outcomes all kind of add up to impacts.
Perfect segue, really. I mean, honestly, could not have set me up better for this next question. So Itamar is with us today. And he said, listen, business leaders are usually very good in communicating the impact they expect. That said, what are some of the ways we can use to explain to them, to our leaders, how our proposed outcomes roll up to the impact they expect? So that's what you were just kind of heading towards.
Yeah. So it's really interesting. This is, in my mind, in the sort of the great, beautiful, optimistic vision of the future. Right? This is the role of middle management, right? It's that the senior leaders know the kind of impacts they're trying to create. And the conversation between that and a bad version of the conversation, you've all been in these bad conversations where, we say something like, we need to reduce costs this year, so we're going to install system X. Right. And it's like, wait a minute, how do you know that system X is going to reduce costs? You've made a logical leap there that doesn't make any sense. And so that middle layer, that outcome layer, that's the piece that middle management is really responsible for understanding and articulating to senior leadership. And more than that, is responsible for, I think, saying like, this is actually what we're going to sign up for. So I'll give you an example. And Jeff and I wrote about this in Sense and Respond. There's a startup we interviewed here in New York. They were about 800 people at the time. And one of the things that their strategic planning process, it sort of had this top down, bottom up approach, where the leaders would say, here are the 4 strategic impacts for the year that we want. And the teams would say, here's all the stuff we want to do, right? And these were the people who knew the product. They knew what was broken. They knew what people were trying to do. And they said, here's all the shit that we want to do for the year, right? And so then what would happen is that middle management layer would look at the strategic goals, and they would look at the list of work, and they would say, okay, everybody knows you're not going to do 100% of this work, right? So what are the things that we are going to do? They're going to roll up to the strategic initiative, right? For example, grow our European business, right? What are the projects we'll do that'll grow our presence in Europe? The rest of it, we just put in a parking lot. But then, and here's the outcome-oriented part, then what the middle management would do is they would sign up for outcomes, not for projects. And they would say, we believe we can grow the European business by X%. We're going to use these projects to try and get there, but we reserve the right to kill any and all of these projects if they're not getting us to the outcome we seek, right? And so that translation layer between the impact layer in the business, the senior management, and the kind of output layer in the business, which are the teams, that's that middle management layer. And I think that's the pivot that I would love to see in organizations that are adopting this stuff.
That's really, really great example. And it, I mean, there's a lot of questions in the list here about like, great, Josh, how do we do that? But I do want to add one period at the end of that sentence. One of the most fascinating exercises that you can do, particularly with your leaders, as you're trying to convince them, is literally just take the name of the teams that you're working on and change them to outcome-focused names.
Yep.
Right? So instead of being the iPhone app team, the iOS app team, right? You're now the mobile commerce team. Right? Same people, same skill sets, probably the same business challenge as well, right? But what you've done here is you've changed the measure of success, right? Instead of shipping the app, you've now got to increase mobile commerce. And that starts to at least open, it creates bandwidth for dialogue. So it's a good start. All right. Lots of stuff in here and a couple of kind of repeats. And so we'll get to them in a second, but this one's good. It's good. And it's a good tactical question. So Amit is asking, how important are percentages in outcomes? Example, 20% increase. And then how do you come up with that number? Like how much is enough?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think percentages are really critical. Like, I think if you just say like, well, we want 100 signups, like, well, I don't know, is that good or bad? Right. Like, I don't know. So, percentages and ratios and rates are useful because they let you kind of track improvement over time. They let you do kind of cohort testing. And so just in general, ratios and rates are a better way to measure. You don't know, right? I mean, you may or may not have a baseline measure, right? People are currently signing up, churn is X, and we want to reduce churn from X to Y. You don't know what's a good number, but this is the conversation with stakeholders is what are you willing to write a check for, right? If I take churn down, 5%, do you care about that? Stakeholder, that might be a lot of money, right? In a big organization, that could be a vast amount of money. In a small organization, the stakeholders would be like, no, that's not a big problem. I don't care, right? If you say I can reduce churn 100%, oh, well, that I'll write you a check for, and I'll let you have a team for 3 months to work on that, right? So setting that number is kind of arbitrary, and it's really about how important is this to the business. And if I look at this at the impact level, can I create a model, a financial model, or some other model that that shows me what I'm likely to get for putting a team on this for a month or 2 months or 3 months?
Yeah, I love that. What will you write a check for? Right.
Yeah.
That's a perfect question, right? 20% increase in retention, 50%, right? Let's talk about that. And by the way, when it comes to percents, right, one of the biggest takeaways I got from reading Lean Analytics a couple of times is percents and ratios, right? That's how you want to quantify these outcomes because it gives you a sense of how you're trending and how you're moving forward. So. Awesome. Okay, cool. A couple of questions on this topic here, and a conversation that you and I were just having on text over the last 24 hours as well. So this is Daniel asking, but there's a couple of folks asking the same question here as well. A CEO asked me today how to get staff to switch to outcomes when the team is based on feature roadmaps. What would you say? Right. So most roadmaps that we see are based on features, right? We'll build you these 5 things. We'll get them done by Thursday, right? How do you get them to switch to an outcome-based roadmap or whatever the tool should be?
I mean, part of me thinks like, how do you get people to eat vegetarian at McDonald's? Like, like it's part of a big system,
right?
Like you
get Questlove to sponsor it. I think
like a lot of these systems, a lot of these techniques don't work in as a kind of as a limited change. They imply that the larger context in which you're working it either changes or it's flexible enough to accommodate this change. So often the question that will help you start with outcomes, I know a lot of people are asking, how do I get started, right? Often the question that helps you get started is just asking, how do I know? How do I know that this feature is going to work? And what change in behavior will I see as a result of this feature working, right? So in Scrum, you have the definition of done, right? And the definition of done says we've made this piece of software. It passes all of the functional requirements. It passes all the non-functional requirements, and we're ready to release it. great. You've created an output. That's good. I'm not trivializing that. But then you put this button in the world or this feature. How do you know it's actually working, right? And I think for a lot of teams, especially teams that are working in a feature-based roadmap world, you don't care. The organization kind of implicitly doesn't care if it's working or not. It's like, well, we got to that place in the roadmap. We checked it off. We promised sales we would deliver it. Check. We promised customers we would deliver it. Check. Let's move on to the next thing. And so if you care about whether it's working or not, you need to ask, how will I know? And you'll know when people start signing up for your mailing list or abandoning your cart less frequently or doing whatever that change in behavior is. Once you've asked that question yourself on the team, then you have the opportunity to go back to the people who are reading the roadmap and start to express the things that are on the roadmap in those terms, right? We've shipped the first version of feature X, and we've reduced X by, we've changed this measure, right? And hopefully then the conversation about the measure gets people interested, and you can start to have a conversation about why that conversation is better than the other one. It doesn't always work, right? If you're in a sales-driven organization, if you're promising features in sales contracts, that's a different kind of organization, and outcomes may not be the right tool for you, right, in that situation.
Oh. Yeah. I'm bouncing around in the questions a little bit because there's a lot of questions that are circling around kind of the same idea, different ways of asking it. So I'll ask a couple of them and then we'll see how we go. But it's about getting organizational buy-in, more specifically management buy-in into this outcomes mentality, right? Especially when, and there's two qualities. When you're managing the output, there are at least two management qualities that are clear and easy to assess and to measure, and that traditionally belong to management. So one is control, right? So I tell you what to do, right? Make me an iPhone app, put a stop sign on that corner, right? Whatever it is. And that's my job because I'm your boss. I tell you what to do. Right. And so we've got one question in here from Angela where she's saying, look, there's clearly a desire by the C-suite to want outputs because it gives them control, right? And they resist outcomes because as soon as you like, I'll come back to my example from before, right? If I tell you to make the iPhone app, I know what I told you to do and I know what it looks like when it's done, right? And if somebody asks me what you're doing, if my boss asks me, I say, Josh is working on the iPhone app, right? But if I say increase mobile commerce, and then my boss comes to me and says, hey, what's Josh doing? I don't know. He's increasing mobile commerce, I hope.
I'm over here increasing mobile commerce every day.
Right, exactly. So how do you so I'll start with that version of the question is, how do you start to kind of break that look, it's panic, right? If I tell you what to do, I know what you're doing. If I tell you to change behavior and I don't know what you're doing, I'm going to get up in your face on a regular basis and try to get that understanding. How do we diffuse that?
Yeah. So, my experience is that most senior leadership would actually like to be out of the game of telling teams what to do, right? That's not true at the middle layers of the organization, but at the senior most levels of the organization, when you talk to them about outcomes, they're all in. And their problem is that they're operating at such a high level in the business that they can't meaningfully get down to the team level and decompose the impacts into the outcomes that they're seeking. They're all in, and what they want is that frozen middle to change, and they don't know how to do it. So that's the first thing. At the highest level, I think they know they don't have that control, right? And my experience is that, most of them want to move to this new way of working. Mm-hmm. In the middle layer, I think it's not so much an unwillingness as a lack of understanding that there's a new way to do it and what that new way entails. And by the way, that new way, you got to be a middle manager because you were good at coming up with the answers, right? And now guess what? You're a middle manager, and now you have to be good at coming up with the questions. And that's a new skill, right? And all of us as humans, we want to hold on to the old skills that we're good at. It's much easier to hold on to those old skills than to learn the new skills. I wrote a little bit about this in the book. There's a case study in there of HBR.org, who transitioned from a kind of an output-centric to an outcome-centric way of working. And one of the things that they discovered was that there was a lot of new kinds of communications that they needed to do with stakeholders to make this work. And so the first thing that they were doing with stakeholders was they were saying to them, tell me a story about what you're worried about in your business, right? As opposed to saying, what problems should we solve or what features should we build? Tell me a story about what you're worried about, right? Because they're trying to do a good job, right? So what are they trying to achieve? And helping orient the work around solving that, they found that that was a really, really valuable technique. And then kind of over communicating context, right? So every week stopping in on stakeholders, middle management, saying, this is what we're working on, this is what we're working on, here's how it's going, right? That sort of like it, as you're shifting the sort of control unit from do this to achieve this, it really requires shifting the communication around here's what we're doing, because it's no longer visible in the burn down charts or whatever, right?
Yeah. Marie's got a question that's also kind of in orbit of the same challenge, but it's a different angle on it. But I think it's a really important one to cover as well. So Marie says, look, she says, how do you get management in the organization to buy into outcomes, right? Same question, but the twist here, the different facet here is that when they are judged on the ability to output, right? So the thing that has gotten me rewarded is delivery, right? I'm the person who gets it done, right? Yeah. I get the app out on time. How do we, what has to change in order to incentivize people to manage to shift their focus to outcomes?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really. I mean, that's a kind of a general question that's hard to answer generally. I will tell you, I'm working with an internal IT team right now at a big firm, and it's a financial services firm here in New York, and it's a very it's a company that does trading essentially for a living. So they buy low and sell high, and it's very, the pressure for short-term thinking in that environment is really, really high. So they've got an old system that they use. They've got old systems all over the organization, and those systems are swimming in technical debt. And so delivery culture is get the feature out, get the feature out. We need a new feature. We need a new feature. The regulation has changed. Get the feature, get the feature, get the feature. And after 10, 15 years of that, you're swimming in technical debt. And so what do? Well, you can keep working that way, right? And you can continue to accumulate technical debt. And then what happens is over time, shipping becomes harder and harder and slower and more expensive and requires more and more people, right? Or you can cut over to some new system. And the cutting over, right? Nobody wants to do that, right? Because you've got a system that works. Why would you cut over to this risky new system? And so the way I'm trying to work with them is to say, like, look, here are the challenges you're facing on this old system, right? We know we need to get to this new system. It's not about just efficient delivery, right? It's about some new measure here, right? It's about stability and risk. And so what we've done is we've said, like, we have a goal for this new system, which is to start with an adoption outcome. Can we start getting people to adopt the new system? And what might we do to get people to adopt this new system for a single use case? Can we get people to adopt the system for 2% of their use cases, 3% of their use cases, whatever that is? And so I guess the answer to the question is that you need to look at what's behind that delivery culture and look for kind of step back opportunities to say, where is that delivery culture getting us in trouble? Is it working for us? Great. Maybe we don't change it, right? But if it's causing us trouble, how do we step away from the delivery culture to what we're all really here to do, which is to build reliable, low-cost systems to serve our internal users, right? And our systems are getting less and less reliable and less low cost over time, right? That's the impact we're seeking. How do we start to move towards that? That might be one way to do it without knowing your specific circumstance. Hard to go deeper.
Yep. It's interesting, right? So one of the things that I know you've seen this as well, but one of the things that I see repeatedly, I see organizations desperately trying to transform and to build this way of working as a standard, and they do everything right, but they forget the incentive structure. They put in the outcome measures. They work through some of these challenges. They do the things that you're recommending, but they don't change how we measure someone's performance. So if we measured you to output before, and now we're saying, look, you've got to work towards outcomes, but we don't change that performance management criteria, it's going to break, right? It's going to break every time. And so that's something that if you're in a position to bring up the incentives and performance management conversation at your place of work, that's something that has to happen to support this transition. The other thing I was thinking about as you were talking was, you remember the story? We were working with a big bank in the U.S. and one of these back end teams came up to the executive in charge of this particular department, and they said to her, we need to take this old platform and lift and shift it to this new platform, and it's going to take $20 million and 2 years to do that. And when she said back to them, and she said, look, that's great. I'm going to give you 6 months and $5 million. And at the end of that 6 months and that $5 million, I want you to deliver some value, right? And value is outcomes, right? It's customers behaving differently in the system that benefits them and us as a business, right? And if you can do that, I will give you 6 more months and $5 more million. Right. And so as an executive top down, I think you've got an opportunity as well to rethink how you're funding these projects and really challenge your teams to rethink how they approach delivery in a way that produces value sooner.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that maybe we haven't called out explicitly is that when we're talking about outputs, you're either done or you're not done. Right. But when you're talking, and it's often the case then that we scope up really big, right? And we're like trying to deliver this thing for, 6 months, a year, 2 years, whatever. But you're either done or you're not done. With outcomes, you have the opportunity to deliver value continuously, right? We're going to get 1% of our users running. We're going to get 2% of our users going. We're going to get 3% of our users going, or we're going to increase this behavior by X% and then Y% and then Z%. And so it gives you the opportunity to take a more continuous value delivery kind of frame of reference, way of working,
Mm-hmm. Yep. Cool. Let's shift gears for just a second. Because Bill's got a couple of questions that I think are related, and they focus a little bit about experiment design, right? So the types of things that we said ship, sense, and respond, right? So what are we shipping when it comes to testing whether or not our ideas are going to change these outcomes? Are they A/B tests? How long do these things run? 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 3 months? Do you wait for one to run its course before you line up the next one? So lots of little questions, but generally speaking, how do you approach experiment design to see if the output that you're working on will generate the outcomes you're striving for?
Yeah. Yes. All of the above.
All of those things.
I mean, so one of the things about all of this stuff is that, just as with the stop sign example, you don't know if your output is going to work. Right?
Yep.
And so you might not even be sure that intersection is dangerous, right? Boss says it's dangerous. Maybe it's not even dangerous. Just your boss, your boss got honked at in the intersection and is ticked off and is like, fix that damn thing, right? Like, you don't know that it's dangerous. So all of this stuff requires that, or it implies that you're able to go out and figure out the logical connections here.
Yeah.
Like maybe the first thing you do is you go, you set a camera up in the intersection and you watch the intersection, or you put one, I don't know what they call those things, those rubber things that go across the intersection that, you know, measure traffic or whatever. Like maybe you just have to figure out if the intersection is dangerous, or you go and you look in the records and you see how many accidents have been reported at that intersection. First thing, is it a problem, right? Your experiment there is actually just research, right? You may not even be shipping anything beyond like send some people out to do some research, send some people out to watch the intersection, to do some counting. Then you're like, okay, well, I think that a stop sign is going to work. How expensive is it to build a stop sign versus running a quick test? Like maybe I've got a couple of spare stop signs sitting around or a temporary barricade or something like that. And the Department of Public Works can just drop one on from a truck, you know, and I don't have to actually dig a hole and pour the cement, and it's cheaper or whatever, right? Maybe it's more, so in each of these cases, what you're doing is you're looking at what you don't know, and you're saying, what's the cheapest, fastest way to learn what I don't know, right? And at some point, you kind of switch over from the sort of learning what I don't know to actually starting to implement measures that really will change the outcome, right? So the kind of first experiments may be indirect, like observing this thing, you're not actually changing the outcome. But eventually you learn enough to start interventions, you start those interventions and you start making a difference.
Got it. Cool. We've got about 6-7 minutes left. There's at least 2 or 3 questions in the list here that are about OKRs. And so, the question is this OKRs? And if it's not, how does it fit into OKRs? What's the compare and contrast, or like, how does this fit into the world of objectives and key results?
So I think this works really, really well as a complement to OKRs. And I think the key connection here is that if you write KRs that are outcomes, that makes the whole thing kind of sync up beautifully.
Right on.
Right.
Good.
I mean, that's a short answer.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that, yeah, if your KR is an outcome, a measure of human behavior, then your OKRs are good OKRs, or at least.
And if your KRs are outputs, right, those kind of fall into the bad OKR pattern. Yeah, we made a system. Like, who cares? Did it achieve the objective? How do you know? Right. And so that's one way to look at your OKRs and kind of critique them, is to say, how do I know that doing this work will achieve my objective? Right. In this case, objective and impact are kind of synonyms. That how do I know question that's the door.
Got it. Where is it? I just saw it here a second ago. This was interesting because it's a similar question to the one we had before, but instead of internally focused, this one is externally focused. So Max was asking, how do you raise awareness among your clients to focus on outcomes over outputs? So if you're, in-house is one thing, but as an external consultant, how do you bring that into the conversation? How have you brought that into the conversation?
Yeah. We wrote a case study about this in Sense and Respond too. If you're an agent, I assume if you're talking about clients, you're in an agency. One of the challenges in an agency is that you've written a contract with your client, and that contract may limit your ability to work in an outcome-focused way. So if your contract is time and materials, that's fine. You can work in an outcome-focused way. If your contract says, well, we're going to give you these deliverables, all right, you've just locked yourself legally into a legal obligation to work to outputs, right? So being able to talk about this stuff with your client starts in the sales and scoping process. And it gets poured into concrete with the contract. The real way to do it is in sales, and during your sales and scoping process, you ask the client, you have this conversation, how do we know this thing that we're building is the right thing to build? right? And how do we find out quickly and inexpensively without wasting your money? And that may mean that you do a phase of work that is you're kind of in your early phase of work that's about scoping the work, is really that's your outcome focused phase, or that's your experiment phase where you're doing that learning to get enough certainty that your subsequent phases can be more traditionally output focused.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember many potential clients of ours who from the beginning was like, yes, we want to work this way. Yes, we get this. Yeah, let's change behavior. And then you get to the procurement part of the conversation. They're like,
what are the deliverables, right?
Right. Like, how many wireframes am I getting? Right. How many pixels are you selling me for this money? All right. One last one. We got 3 minutes left. Let's make this one a quick answer, I hope, and then we'll wrap this up. How do you prioritize outcomes?
How do you prioritize them?
Yeah.
That's a great question. There's no, I don't have a quick deterministic answer for that. You have to look at the outcomes and you have to sort of say, we're trying to achieve this. What do we feel is the most important thing to work on for our business right now? And that's a place where you start to get into, you kind of move from organizational strategy to product strategy to design strategy. It's, this is the art of the art side of the question.
If you're lucky enough to have an analyst on your team, particularly a curious analyst, somebody who's really genuinely interested in looking for causation and correlation between numbers, they can also help you out, right? They can say, look, when this happens, we stand a greater chance of the outcome being achieved than these other three things, statistically speaking. So maybe we start here.
Yeah, I mean, the more you know, the easier it is to make those decisions. But it's still, it's still looking around the table and going, okay, what do we want to do first?
Yep. Excellent. Josh, thanks so much. Listen, there's at least 10 more questions in the Q&A module that unfortunately we're going to run out of time and not get to. So first of all, thanks very much for taking an hour and sharing your insight with the folks. We had a ton of folks on the call, so that's really, really excellent. We recorded this. And so in a week or two, this will be up on the Sense and Respond Press YouTube channel. If you subscribe over there, all of our past webinars are over there. Tons and tons of content as well. Josh's book at bit.ly/outcomes book with a capital O and a capital B is out now. It's short, it's practical, super easy read. We even estimated the time it will take you to read it there at the top, about 40 minutes. Thanks so much. If you have any feedback for us, don't hesitate to reach out via Twitter or any other channels. Josh, thanks so much. Everyone have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.
See you guys when we do this next time.
Yep.
Take care, folks. Bye.